So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on web APIs. So that's the third lecture and the final one uh, for this part of the course. And today we will talk about something probably more interesting than the previous two lectures. Uh, I also updated the slides on the course page and the reading materials uh, just before the lecture, so you can have a look. Uh, and also, I think at the end of the lecture, we will briefly discuss the assignment if you have any questions on that. Let me. So I will also follow the Slack channel as well as the YouTube chat. So if you have any questions or any comments, put them anywhere you like, and I will follow those in my another screen so that I don't miss any questions from you. So we are in the third part, and today we will talk about how we can design our metadata better, and also how we can represent how we can present the representations of the resources better, and we will finally wrap up with some client concern or issues that burns client most, and also some final thoughts or some recommendations as for API designers to make them more restful and more usable. So the metadata part, or the metadata design, we know that in REST, metadata or resource metadata are provided through HTTP headers. So there are some, sorry, my voice might be a little bit down. So in REST, we have a number of entity headers that are HTTP specific, and some are REST specific. So we should leverage all the entity headers, both standard and non-standard, that are available. And usually for our REST APIs, there are three categories of information we can find in the HTTP headers. So information about the resource itself, so the resource that we requested. Then in the information about the representation, so how the resource is represented in the body or maybe also in the server side. And then the information about the caching or caches. Yes. So the first rule about the metadata design is that since we are talking about also resources in our HTTP headers or in our metadata, we should always use, not always should, it should be must. So we, as an API designer, we must use this content type header, and basically it tells the client what he is going to expect in the entity body or in as a resource representation, and then the client can act based on that, how to process that content, or how to process the entity body. So that's the format for the content type. So you can have type and then also subtypes and then some optional parameter. So these are some of the examples: application, audio, image, text, and video. So these are the types, or main types, or media types, I would say. And then we also have subtypes. So for each group, we might have uh, different other alternatives to represent our uh, resources. Then the second rule, not we should, so according to the first rule, we should not only mention the content type, but we should also mention the content length. So what's the total size of our resource representation? So it should be mentioned also in the HTTP header. And then the good side of is that if you precisely mention the content length, let's say 10 kilobyte of resource representation, then the client can know that if he received the full representation or the complete representation. And also to get the size of a resource, client can make head request. And because we know that head request can be used or should be used to get the metadata of the resource, not the resource itself. So this is also the format of the content length that we can use. Then the third rule, last modified date. We as an API developer also often skip this HTTP header, and that should be also used because this is also very useful for the clients. So they know when the resource was modified last. And then if it's so basically we can also use this last modified value for conditional request. So if it's not reasonable, then the client or the user should not make multiple requests or duplicate requests from the for the same resource that was, let's say, modified 1 year ago or 2 year ago. So it's not very volatile resource. So this is a good practice to include a last modified field in your HTTP header, and it should be by default supplied for all types of GET request. The rule 4, that is about e-tag. E-tag should be also provided in the GET request and in response to the GET request. It's basically an identifier for the resources. So if any resource change in between, or if the state of the resource is changed, basically this e-tag also gets changed. And there is also a mechanism for the clients to identify if there was any intruder or if there was any mid-air collision with the resource. So if someone hack the resource and change it, then the e-tag value will be also changed, or basically the e-tag value that has the client stored in his local machine or in his caching, that value, if the content doesn't match and the e-tag matches, that means there was a mid-air collision. So client can use this e-tag to identify such security vulnerabilities on the resources. So I just also forgot to mention that today we will also have the full lecture without any break, and probably we will finish a little bit earlier. So then, I mean, we don't need maybe a mid break, but it should not be that long, so and not boring. So that's the format for e-tag. You just have e-tag and then e-tag value. Usually, those e-tags are generated by servers, and then clients can store them or use them to fetch or to make conditional GET request. Rule 5, that's also about location, and then that's also about the header. We often don't provide this location header, in particular when this is a must. So when this is a must when you create new resource using post method. So by default, you should provide this location field in your header, and that's why it was said as a must rather than should. So you should remember or consider these two differences or two aspects, like when it's must and when it's should. So providing a location header field as part of your metadata is a must, especially when you are creating new resources. Not even when you are creating new resources, you can still provide the location of the resource that was modified or requested. Rule number 6 is about caching. We already looked at some examples of caching in the first lecture, but caching is also an integral part for REST APIs to be RESTful. So use this cache control, then other fields like expires and date as part of your HTTP headers. And it's not very difficult, it's simple. So just use the age of the resource or validity age of the resource in terms of seconds. And then there are various other ways of doing that. So for example, for HTTP 1.1.0, you can send the date when the resource was requested or created, and then you also send another date or time when the resource current state will expire. And I think if you notice this date format, so I think there is another rule, if I remember, I'm wrong, or maybe not rule, a recommendation, like all your dates should be in the ISO format. Don't use the dates for your locality or the local developers that you use, or not any region specific, rather than make all your dates to ISO standard. And also because you might have clients from all over the world, not only from your country or from your city or from your organization. So it's always recommended to use ISO date format. Rule number 7, let's say you don't want, or you may not want to use caching, or probably you want to use caching, but you want a control over your caching. So what I mean by control, I think is in the next slide. So if you don't want to implement caching, simply say that cache control as a no cache, or for HTTP 1.0, you can use pragma for no caching. And then I have this question probably for you. So what's the difference between no caching and no store? If you already worked with your with caching as part of your API. Any idea or any comments? people who used caching? Or I mean, when we should use no caching or when we should use no store? Store is in the client side, someone said. Yes, that's sort of true. Any other ideas? Let me, when the data change frequently. Yes, I mean, this volatility of data is also related to caching, but I just wanted to know the difference between these two concepts or these two values of cache control. So when we should use cache control and when we should use no store. Sorry, when we should use no cache and when we should use no store. So there is a very clear and um, self-explanatory algorithm from Google uh, that says when we should use no cache and when you should use no store. In general, we use no cache is that this resource should not be cached by the client at all. But then no store is basically when you can do caching, but you cannot, or you should basically not rely on the cached resource whenever you want. Basically, you need to revalidate this resource every time you want to use this resource. So that's the difference between no caching and no store. So if you follow this algorithm, is it by Google? It says, is it a reusable response? If I can reuse it, if I cannot reuse it, that means we cannot store this response at all. So the server will say that cache control is no store. And then if we can store, but we need to revalidate each time, then it's no caching. But if we do not need to revalidate each time, that means this caching could be either public or private. But regardless of private or public resource or caching, we need the e tag or the maximum age values and other caching information anyways. So that's the difference between no caching and no store. So then the rule 8 comes on this caching, that caching should be encouraged. Um, you might not enforce or force all the time to the client to cache, but it should be encouraged both from the server side and the client side. And when you, if you pick to not to do caching at all, this is worse or not a good practice than if you do the caching and have a small age value or small value of max age for the caching. So that's the good practice. If you don't want a large age, do the caching, but put the age to a smaller value so that you have at least the implementation for the caching, but you can simply change the value to make it a small or large, rather than not having a caching and then having a caching or implementing a caching technology. So the rule 8 is about caching that should be used whenever possible or required. Then the rule 9, it's also about the caching, but the expiration of the caching. So whenever you are using a get request or a head request to get metadata or the resource itself, and you are getting a 200 response code, you should always provide this expiration value or date for the caching. Sometimes we only use or provide cache control or the date that the resource was created, but we do not provide this expiration date for the or expiration time for the resources. So this should be also by default part of your HTTP headers. Rule 10. So rule 10 is also controversial, and although it should be followed, but many developers don't follow this rule. That is, the custom HTTP headers must not be used to change the behavior of the HTTP methods, meaning that each HTTP method have their own goals or their own objectives, right? So not each of those methods need all the HTTP headers. So you should be careful which methods, which headers or HTTP fields are required for which method. So definitely you will not have, or you should not have a resource creation date for HTTP method, right? Or you should not have a resource update date for a delete method, and so on. And one of the poor practice is that you use HTTP headers to for other goals than sending the information to the user. So there should not be any functional thing for the HTTP headers. It should be only informational. And if you change, or if the server change the header fields or header items, your client application should not break or should not fail due to a change in HTTP headers. So having a proper sets of HTTP headers or fields in the HTTP headers is important. That is subject to the HTTP methods that you are using. So that's the rule number 10. Then, until now we are talking about metadata or HTTP headers. Now we will also talk about resource or media types or resource types, basically, and how we can design those resources well. So this authority, Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA, it's responsible for allocation of global IPs. It's responsible for defining new media types, new representations, and so on. So this IANA authority defined 10 basic types of document or resource types or media types, in whatever you can call them, like application, audio, font, example, images, and so on. And then these are generic types. If you want your vendor specific or application specific types, you should have a prefix like VND before the name of the media type. So there are many rules, not many, several rules for media types, and I will discuss here some of them. So one of the basic rules is that application specific media types should be used. So what do we mean by application specific media types? So in REST, we know that the interactions between client and server, those are part of the uh, application, or part of the actions that are part of the application. So the media types that are in a request or in the response, they should basically be consistent. And then that's the this rule is about. So your application specific media type should be used, meaning that the interaction between servers and clients, they should be using consistent media types. So if I'm asking for a JSON, I should get only JSON. I should not get XML or any other format. And then on top of that, uh, we should also use this content type header field from the server that will denote the type of the representation of the resource that we have. So you might not always want to use JSON or XML or the traditional types. You can use, for example, WRML, so Web Resource Modeling Language, I think. So you can use this kind of new descriptive media types. And one of the examples is that um, since this WRML is also JSON based, so you should provide format and schema. So the format is about, so the format itself is describing the JSON format, and then you have the schema of, or a form of the player of my resource here. So this WRML representation or the media type include both this field and the value, that format and schema. But you can use, of course, any other media types you prefer, but it should be your application specific. That's the message here. Then the another rule about media types that is also about resource representation, and it says that there should be a negotiation uh, that should be supported for the clients. Basically, as a service provider, or as an API developer, you should provide multiple ways of representation, and then client might ask different types of representations depending on their uh, objectives, or depending on uh, how they want to render this representation. So usually clients use this accept header, but if you do not provide this negotiation opportunity, then basically you are limiting your so basically you have less flexibility of your API. But that's a good practice also to allow media type negotiation by the clients. So that's rule number 12. Then rule number 13 is about query parameter. Uh, it's also about resource representation. And what it says is that uh, instead of using accept request header in your request made by the clients, you can use your URI to as an alternative to accept header basically, and you can parameterize this media type as part of your URI. that's the basically an alternative to the previous rule, but um, this is not a general practice, but you can do this. This is not a forbidden thing. So you can parameterize your URIs to know or to get or to ask the server which representation you want. So that was about metadata. We know that metadata is about uh, the HTTP headers and uh, the metadata about the resources. And we looked at 13 rules. There may be many rules in the book, but I did not introduce all of them. You, as I said earlier, that I already updated with reading materials, so you can look at the chapters and see what are other rules that might interest you. But now we will talk about representation design, and usually some of the HTTP methods, they might have entity body. So this representation design uh, entails or corresponds to those uh, HTTP methods. And in general, we use XML or JSON, but these are not must. You can use, of course, any other representation format for your resources. But having said that, rule number 14 suggests that by default, all the APIs should be supported JSON. And not only it's because everybody use it, but also because it's easy to parse and it's easy to read and extract data for the machines compared to XML. XML is a heavy document that takes good amount of parsing time or processing time for the XML compared to JSON. But not as I said, JSON is a general representation, resource representation language or technology, but you can of course use any other types based on your needs. So even if you are asking for an image or any other data that are not parsable, in other words, you can still send a JSON representation uh, of your image that can contain metadata of your image or information about your image. Then another basic rule, that is rule 15, that says the JSON you are sending must be well formed. That's also very basic requirements, and you should follow the JSON rules to write your JSON documents. Like you should always use double quotes for your keys, and then for the values you might have different types of values like strings, numbers, dates, and so on. But also in JSON, as you know, the dates are not considered as dates, rather than they are strings. So if you are using dates in your JSON document, make sure you are using them as strings, and you are using also the ISO format as suggested earlier. So this is an example, a well-formed JSON example. So as you can see, the keys are within double quotation, and then the strings, numbers, and dates, they have different representation. So strings are usually within the quotes, numbers are not, but then the birth dates or dates are also represented as strings. So make sure that your JSON is well formed. Else, this might break the clients basically if your JSON is not well formed. You can rule 16 says that you can use XML or other formats optionally, but again, if you chose to XML over JSON, you have to make sure that client can negotiate this representation. So XML are least recommended format, but even if you chose to have XML, try to provide this negotiation opportunity for the clients. Then hypermedia representation design. So previously we were talking about resource representation design. Now we will talk about hypermedia representation design. And in the first lecture, I guess there was some confusion or some curiosity about hypermedia. And now we will talk more about hypermedia and what do we mean by hypermedia and how can we design a good hypermedia. So similar to HTML pages or websites, um, where we have links, we have text, we have data, hypermedia in REST is a similar thing, where you might have you have resource representations, you have related resources, and so on. So that's the concept here, that in REST APIs using hypermedia, you can navigate through your application. So the state of the application or the state of the client basically is dynamic and can change with the help of hypermedia. So the rule 17 says or talks about this hypermedia. And we know that hypermedia is all about links or URIs. So it says that a consistent form should be used to represent links. So if you have, let's say, 5 resources or 10 resources, all those 5 or 10 resources should have the same form. So in other words, for one resource, you might have these 5 fields and their values in your JSON as part of the response. You should not, or you cannot have a different representation with different number of fields for other resources. So your resources should be consistent in terms of hypermedia design. And as you can see, you have 5 fields in your one of the hypermedia. So this is an example hypermedia. So you have the resource URL of the target resource that was sent as part of your response. Then there is a relationship link that is basically a descriptive attribute of this target resource, or this describe the relationship between the source resource and the target resource. And then you have the request and response types. So basically, what are the media types that you can use or get for a certain request or responses, and then a optional text. So the last 3 fields are optional, but the first 2 are mandatory. So if you want to have only the mandatory fields for your hypermedia design, you should keep only the mandatory fields for all your resources, and same for the optional. So if you want to keep the optional for one resource, you should keep the optional fields for all your resources. That was the message, or that was the rule, basically. So this is an example of a consistent hypermedia design. Then the rule 18, it says a consistent form should be used to advertise links. So as we know that hypermedia is all about links, but when you are giving or providing links as part of your response, usually in the JSON object or in the JSON document, we have a object called links that provide all the related links for that response. So you should have a consistent form to provide the links. So as you can see, for example, we requested a resource for this person that provides links to other resources, but we have 4 resources or related resource. All of them had the same format, or all of them have the same sets of fields and values. So they do not have different structure or different information related to compared to one another. So that's this rule about. So a consistent form should be used to advertise or send or inform links to the clients. Then this is also one common missed item for your HTTP request or for HTTP methods. So a self link should be included in the response message body. For example, in this case, we are sending a request for this person, and then the server will send a sets of related links. And as you can see, the server also sent a self link. So this self link is basically about this guy, and then maybe other related links. So we should have a self link that is included in your list of links by default. And it's a good practice also. So that was about hypermedia or representation design. Now I will go through some of the client concerns, and then we will have some final thoughts on the REST APIs. So those clients concerns include versioning of your APIs, security in your APIs, then the REST representation, or how you compose your representation, how you process your hypermedia, and also what we should do when it comes to JavaScript client and so on. But I want to start with the versioning. So we know that a REST resource model is kind of similar to relational database model. So they are interlinked resources. So you can traverse from one resource to another resource in the same way that you can go from one link to another link. But there can be a situation where you have multiple versions of resource, and each of those versions might also have different representations of the same resource. So the rule 20 is about this versioning that says if you are creating a new version of your resources, that means you are creating a new resource, not resource, new URIs for your resources. So even if you change a slight part of your URI, that means it refers to a new resource. And the general guideline is that to avoid this confusion for the clients, you should not use versioning as part of your, or resource versioning as part of your URI design. So I have 2 examples here. One is about restful.com/API v2/France, and then the resource part of it. And then another one is restful.com/API without the version. So out of these two version of URI design, which one you pick, you think, or which one you prefer, you think, or which one you should follow, you think? And probably also why. Any thoughts on this, or what you usually do in your daily life? Okay, someone said the one without the version number. Any other thoughts? So then if you want to prefer the one without the version number, so why would you prefer that as a client or as a developer? I mean, from the both side. Okay, someone said we have used the first one before. Mhm. Okay, so it seems that so far you have used the first example, but yes, there is also a debate. Like, I mean, it might not be always the case that all your clients are using, yeah, the latest version of your API. So it can be the case that some clients are using the V2, where many of the old clients are still using V1 and they did not migrate to the new API or new services. So logically, basically, you are having uh, same resource but identified using two different URIs. So to avoid this confusion, basically, it's not a good idea to include version in your URI. But I know that there is also some authors or some practitioners that also argue about including versioning information as part of your URI design. But it can be useful for the server side developers, but might not be great for clients or client side developers. So that's one of the big concern for the clients, basically the versioning. So and there is another rule that is also about versions, but in reality, basically, if a resource gets changed, they get new tags, right? So if a resource change, that means it should also have a new identifier. That means it's a new version. So that's that rule 4 told about this. So any change in the resources should be considered as a new resource in terms of tag. So whenever tag change, we say that it's a new version of the resource. So this is closely aligned with the versioning uh, of the resources. Then another concern is about the security, so security of the resources or security of the resource server, and we should use some techniques to prevent unauthorized access to our secured resources. And we already discussed this a bit, but OAuth is one of the techniques to protect your resources. Basically, you are authenticated using some third-party libraries or applications uh, without offering or revealing your credentials. That's one very common approach to manage this security concern of the clients, is that using this OAuth. And for many large API providers or RESTful API providers, they also open use this OAuth these days. Another client concern is response representation, or how you compose your representation. And regarding this concern, basically the client should be able to fine tune or tune your responses. So a client can do that by uh, making some customized query. In other words, in its query component, it can specify that it wants a partial response of data uh, for partial data from a resource representations that have the full or the full sets of information from by the server side, but the client want only a part of it. And that can be done in this way. Basically, you make a GET request, and then you filter in your parameter part, in the query part, using fields equals to those information that you want only in your response. And in response to that, client basically, the server basically sends only those information, not any other information. Although the server might have more information than you asked for. So this is also an useful tool for the clients to make partial requests, to get partial responses. But there is also another way, or not another way, there is an opposite way that you can use. So in the previous example, you mentioned which fields you want, but in this example, you mentioned which fields you don't want. So you just add a exclamation or exclamatory sign before the bracket and says that I want all the fields except the address and the schedule except the Wednesday and Friday and so on. So this is one way of removing unwanted fields. So the server responds with all the fields except the address, and the schedule uh, except the Wednesday and Friday. So in the schedule, as you can see, there is only Monday. So this is one way that, or one of the concerns or client concerns that can be handled or managed by composing or fine-tuning resource representations. So then I think this was one of the final client concerns. So is that how the client usually process the hypermedia. So this is also from the book, so you can read from the book in detail if you want. So usually we have these representations where we have links. In the links, we have the links to the target resource, we have the link relation, and we have other links. So the client basically starts by parsing this representation, and when it's parsing the representation, it look for this particular part or this particular object, like the links. So it isolate or extract only this link part from the JSON representation. And then from these links, we have since two parts, href and rel or relation. The client further extract this relation link, and then client decide if the relation link or the resource that is in the relation link is already available, or already the information is already with the client or not. If it's already with the client, basically it use the recommended method to get this new resource, or the target resource uh, that is mentioned under href. But if the resource or the attribute, descriptive attribute that is mentioned in rel is not yet available or not downloaded by clients, what client does is usually download this or get this representation or description of the representation from the server using the get method, and then do the next step, meaning that use the appropriate method and then get this target resource. So this is one typical steps when the clients are processing the hypermedia. And now you know what hypermedia means and how the clients process this hypermedia. So hypermedia is all about links that you can follow to as if you are navigating the application or navigating the websites. So some final thoughts. Microsoft provides a very well organized and well-defined REST API guideline. So you can look at this link and you will see a number of rules also there that Microsoft APIs or developers at Microsoft follows when they are providing APIs. So URL structure, one of the very good practice in designing your URIs, that it should be human readable. So by looking at the URL or URI, we should be able to tell what's this URI or URL is doing and what information it's fetching and so on. So one of the good example is that, for example, there's a mailbox of Joe. So by this or making a request on this URI or URL in this case, we are basically getting the mailbox of Joe. But this same request can be also made by this URL, which is not readable at all, and thus it hinders the understandability and usability of this API or of this URL in this case. So the first one is a good example and the second one is a bad example. Then there is also another thoughts about the length. Usually we have a shorter or not very long URLs, but sometimes it can happen that, for example, in the second example, I didn't count how many characters you have, but usually it's recommended that you have maximum 2000 characters in your URL, because some search engines have limitations, some browsers have limitations. Although there is no official length limit of the URLs, but you should probably have maximum 2000 characters, although we rarely cross that limit, but don't go over 2000 characters. And that was also discussed in this standard RFC 7230. The resource creation, that is another one of the major problems. That's why I introduced it here again. So we should use post method to create resources, but that's obvious. But then after we created the resource, we as an API developer most of the time forget to provide the new location or the location of the new resource that has been created. That's also said in the rule 5, if you remember. So there was a question. The good example had the version number. Let me see. I didn't notice probably. Yes, the good example seems have a version number, but the goal here was to see to discuss basically the next part of the API or the resource part of the API or the URL. So in the resource, as you can see, the resource model is clearly or easy to read here, but here the resource model is not very easy to read. So it's a kind of opaque URI and not a hierarchical representation of the URI. But yes, you are right, David, that there was a version in the good example. But then, as I mentioned, that people also debate about this versioning, whether we should include or not. So there is this mixed thoughts on this, so to speak. Okay. So that's what I mentioned also. So when you create new resources using post method, always include the location. So this is an example of standard request and response headers. The reason I'm showing the standard request and response headers is that you should include all of them, and if in your implementation, and if you think that some of the headers might not be applicable, just put a null value or keep it empty, but keep a consistent design of your resources and of your request and responses. As a good practice. So the response format, we already mentioned that the default representation of the resources should be JSON, but then when you are creating JSON properties, so basically properties are combination of keys and the values, so they combinedly known as properties. So that they should be, especially the keys part, the first part, should be camel cased, and making it camel cased is makes easier for the client developers to parse your JSON and use it for rendering or for other representations. So that's what it says. Use the JSON, and for your property names or for your identifiers, use the camel case names. Okay, I think I will finish this lecture with this 10 bad API design practices or worst API design practices that you can avoid or should avoid. And those 10 API design practices were discussed by Joe, who is a senior technical principal in a consultant company, and this consultant company is a international consultant company who is working in many countries. So he discussed these 10 design practices in a blog, basically, and I'm introducing those practices from that blog. So the first one is to not to implement pagination. So people might think that, okay, I have a small number of resources, I have small resources in size, so I don't need pagination. I just respond with a bulk of, or with the resource that I have. So this list of resource or the size of the existing resource, it might grow eventually, right? So by default, you should implement pagination. So basically, when you are designing your URIs, you should include pagination. I think one of the rules that we mentioned earlier in the previous lecture. So one of the poor design practice is you do not implement pagination intentionally. Then number 9, or one of the common poor design practice is to not to use proper HTTP methods. And this we also mentioned previously, that you should use HTTP methods that are semantically consistent or correct with your application logic. Then this I think also I mentioned just some slides ago, that whenever you are using dates, always use ISO date, so ISO 8601 standard dates, and in this way, no matter where your client is, they can treat the dates in the same way, and it will create less confusion, or it might not break the client's application. So having a consistent date format is also important. Not to use static contracts. So as we know that the resource representations or even the API specifications, in this case, for example, open APIs, we should use a static constraint, so contract. So what we mean by static contract is that what we promised to the client should be offered to the client, so it should not be changed. Let's say we promised to offer JSON, but then we don't have JSON, but client asked for JSON, instead we are sending it in XML. So this is one kind of breaching of the contract between clients and server. Number 6, not to use consistent data models across different endpoints. So you might have many resources, you might have many services that are provided or that are served using the same API model. So this API should also have a consistent data model, although you might have different data points. So what I mean is that, let's say you have an account resource, and this account resource might be used in different endpoints, but then you should use only the account resource, not SCC, or not accounts, or not any other form of account resources that mean, or that refers to the same or single resource. So in other words, one single resource should not be identified by multiple identifiers or multiple names. Number five, if you try to save data transfer cost by using abbreviated field names, in particular in the JSON or in your resource representation, if you think that if I use a very short form or very short text, it will save your bandwidth, that's that's not a right idea, or that's a wrong concept basically. That doesn't save much, but if you really want to save your bandwidth, you should use compression, or the compression techniques that we discussed in the first lecture. So you should include the compression headers also uh, in your HTTP header. So compression field in your HTTP header. Um, One of the mistakes that API developers does is to return HTML markup as their response. But this is also a poor practice, because as a API developer, you should not be concerned about the representation or the rendering of the information. Uh, so it should be client concern how they will render the information. All you need to do is to send a JSON, and then it's up to the client if he wants to make a HTML, or if he wants to make a PDF, or if he want to make any other form of representation using those response. Number three, this also we discussed in our previous lecture on a series of rules that you should use proper HTTP status code, not to confuse clients, and also uh, not to miscommunicate with the clients. And this is also a common practice. And then another poor practice is to not to leverage HTTP to maximize efficiency. So as you know that we have many HTTP headers, we have many HTTP methods that are particularly useful for REST APIs. So we should leverage them as much as possible to maximize the efficiency and benefits of REST APIs. And finally, this is one of the most common problem, and probably uh, one of the most common problem that hurt most to the clients is that not to document your API properly, and not to provide example responses and example requests for the clients. So if you will find that many large APIs, uh, it can be YouTube, it can be Google, it can be Facebook, and so on, they don't provide a um, well organized documentation. And not only that, although there is open API, not many or very few API providers to till date use this open API specification. And RESTful services are very good candidates to describe using open API. So you should document your API well and properly. And while talking about documentation, I think as part of the assignment, there is also a requirement that you should document your API and API design. So that's why I wanted to discuss also this and take this final opportunity to discuss the assignment. Uh, so as you know, there are some mandatory API design requirements. Some of the design requirements we already discussed during our discussions using the rules. So those some of them are obvious. One problem that I found from the previous year is about Postman and Newman collections. So people provide those Postman collections, but then there is authentication problem. Uh, so the bearer token or any other credentials, they are not part of the Postman collection, or uh, when I run the Postman collection, it fails to authenticate, and some of the protected resources are not uh, returned by the API. Uh, then the linguistic design rules. So there are 13 rules in here, but we discussed about 50, I think. So today we discussed 23, and in the second lecture we discussed 27. So there were 50 rules. I only listed here 13 rules. You can consider other rules, but you need to do is must implement at least 5 rules, and not only implement those rules, you need to discuss those rules in your report. So that's what I wanted to show now. So in your report that you are writing or you will be writing, uh, you should, as part of point 6, you should mention which linguistic design rules have you implemented. You should list them and motivate each of them briefly why you pick those 5 out of many, or out of 30 that I mentioned here. And another missing part that people forget is that a document is, this is a separate document, so it's not this report, a separate document written in named in this way. So last name underscore API documentation, where you will list all your resource URI and their corresponding brief descriptions. So what I mean is that you might have, let's say, 5 URIs, and you might have 4 HTTP methods that you implemented. Of course, not all of them will be applicable to all the resource, but there might be an exhaustive combination of your HTTP methods and uh, the URIs that on which these HTTP methods can be applied or should be applied. So what you need to do is to make a file and then describe each pair of your HTTP method and URI briefly. So in this case, if you have a resource /fish/types, and you have the get, put, post, and delete method that you can operate on this resource, what you need to do, you need to describe what it will do if I use a get method on this resource, what it will do or it will need if you apply put method on this resource, then delete method on this resource, and so on. So you need to describe each pair of HTTP method and URI. And if you miss also this file, your submission will not be evaluated also. So just to remind you this final part. And yeah, I think that was it that I wanted to discuss. And there was a question already that I missed, probably by David. It says, if one include more than 5 rules, should all be discussed or just pick 5 of them to discuss? If you implement more than 5 rules, you should discuss all of them, but don't discuss like large text or long in a long document. So make it brief and short. But the idea is that whatever number of rules you implement, you discuss all of them. Basically, not discuss, you need to motivate why you chose them. Because from the lectures you already know what those rules mean. So that's not I expecting. What I'm expecting is why you pick the rules and why you think it's important to you. That's the idea. So I think that was the things that I wanted to discuss today, and we are done with our 3 lectures. uh, some of you already prior have started uh, working on your project. If not, you will start working on your project. And I think, if I remember correctly, the deadline is not the course press, not the schema. No, weekly planning. So the deadline is on week 8. So week 8 means, let me see the calendar. I'm just reminding you the deadline. So week 8 is Friday, that is February 25th. So that's the deadline for your assignment submission or project submission. So start working on your project, and we will probably also have a tutoring session next week. So if you have any questions, you can join the tutoring session and continue your work. So any other? Yes, translate February 25th. Yeah, that was right. So any other questions before we close the session? If not, I also got a question from Tamim on Slack. I will come back to you later. If not, then have a nice afternoon, rest of the day, and talk to you soon. And good luck with your project. Yeah, bye bye.